Alok, I would love it if you could touch more on emerging markets. You hinted at that a little bit in the beginning, and so if you think about the big two, China and India,
Right.
um, being a major source of
Hmm.
uh, CO2 emissions, um, do you feel that just knowing what you know, that there is a roadmap for those guys to get sort of on board? We've had speakers come on and indicate, for example, that the U.S. has finally been able to decouple GDP from CO2 emissions, primarily because of the transition from coal to gas. So I always like to give a shout out to our home country. Hey, we're doing good. We're not where we need to be. We're still a huge, obviously, source,
Hmm.
but at least we're headed in the right direction. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on emerging markets, where they're headed, and what do things look like for them, and is it the same or is it a little bit different from, let's say, the U.S. and Europe?
That's a very good question, Peter. And when it comes to emerging markets, the dynamics that are really playing are different, definitely different. Because when you look at India, for example, India is at the crossroads um, of two important fronts. Number one is economic growth, right? That's a priority for a country like India. And the second one is playing a very important role in dealing with the climate crisis, right? And both these two things will have to be addressed. Now, one thing which is common for both these areas is energy. And energy is going to be a very, very, very crucial determinant in how India or any other emerging economy is performing in both these areas, right? So that's where India needs to think what it really needs to do. So and that's where the strategies will have to rely on to what extent does it really need to adopt the technologies? Does it really need to copy the West, or look at its own resource constraints, or its own ecosystem? So at this point, for example, we are doing really well in terms of adoption of solar, right? So we had initially set a target for achieving 175 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2022, which has now been increased to 400 gigawatts by 2024 by the current regime. Now, even though we are behind the schedule, but just setting these aggressive targets, we are growing much faster than we were growing earlier. India is actually heading the International Solar Alliance, and the idea is to really mobilize the resources and different stakeholders who could come together so that the capacity addition growth is super accelerated. Now, there are certain challenges that we do need to address. Because so much is going on, the scale is huge. There is a lot of suboptimal utilization of resources, and there is a bit of confusion in terms of what's the right policy and the way it translates into how should I put it, inefficiency in the system, which results in sort of discouraging private sector players from participating, because ultimately what really happens is that their profit margins are squeezed. And I'm going to make a very bold statement here. Uh, when I look at the entire picture of an emerging economy, while it is growing, there's a huge opportunity area wherein if they focus on improving the optimization, it could be a game changer. And in that value chain optimization in particular can be a game changer for these economies, because I'll give you an example. Right before the pandemic hit us, this we- the kind of renewable energy targets that we had set for India to be achieved by 2022, we had accomplished 30% of the goal in 70% of the time, which means that 70% of the target was remaining, and we only had 30% of the time. Now, in order to really amp up, we need more and more investment. We need more and more private sector players to operate. Um, the biggest discouraging factors is an extremely squeezed profit margins, especially when you will see that the levelized cost of energy in India is one of the lowest in the world. Now,
Mm.
in that kind of a scenario, uh, relieving pressure from the profit margin by every 1% will count, will matter. And that is the potential which value chain optimization can really unlock. And that's the reason I say that it could be a game changer in emerging economies like India.
So could I
No,
could I
that's
talk
that's really helpful. Yes,
sorry,
David, please jump in.
one additional comment on emerging markets? There's a as Alok mentioned, the capacity to finance the projects is a constraint, and the capacity to finance the projects is not just a matter of money. It's a matter of regulatory frameworks and defining, for example, what energy storage is and whether it's an energy whether it's a form of energy or not, and how it should be, if its pricing should be regulated, which is a major issue in the United States, still kind of being rolled out across various states, and it has been hampering it. So, and my point is that financing of the energy production and energy technologies is as important as actually the money. Let me give you an example. You know, you know what a home mortgage is, right? You know what a credit card is, right? So before home mortgages were created, you had to shell out a whole lot of money to buy a house, and not many people could do that. So as a result, certain people lived in castles, and other people were homeless, and that existed for millennia like that, really. And the home mortgages kind of created this market where middle class people could access home buying. Well, it's sort of a similar thing going on in the energy industry. If you structure the pricing for some of these plants in a way that it can be paid back in time, and and the countries, especially developing countries, can access low cost financing, and it can be sort of the proper hedging instruments and arbitrage instruments be put in place to minimize the risk, they become more financeable. You have companies like Renaissance Capital going out there investing in power, renewable power in developing markets and in Eastern Europe and other places like that. Um, a lot of the ability to do that depends on de-risking, and de-risking can be done through creative financial instruments. There's a guy at the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, named Peter Mockel. Peter works on financing instruments, especially for energy storage in developing markets, and it's just around that. So it's not just a matter of millions and billions of dollars. It's also a matter of creating and crafting creative pricing and financial instruments that can, like the kind earlier I was describing with the power arbitrage between the Finnish and the Colombian company, that can create value where there wasn't value before. That if you can do that, you don't need capital.
That's a really great point. And it's amazing you bring that up because we had originally structured the Power Talks format to be decarbonization, digitization, and decentralization. We just wanted to talk operational stuff just because that happened to be who was interested. But as we started talking to more and more people, we had to add a fourth component that's really mostly around finance and geopolitics because that area is huge to to the world of energy. And exactly what you said, I've had so many creative financial folks come out of the woodwork to talk about unique financing structures, and we
Mhm.
forget. And I'm really glad you brought up the point about home mortgages because uh, I think over the last 20 years there's been a lot of negativity around the financialization of things, but we forget how that's democratized the access to luxuries that previously in previous millennia, as you mentioned, were never available to the average folks. So we have to tip our hat to the financial world. Of course, the new renewal of the ESG theme is enormous with BlackRock now saying they're going to invest in companies 7 trillion in assets based on their ESG score. For more energy superheroes with Peter Perry, visit energy.media.